Chair, Mr. Colby, who instigated the war in Gaza?
Well, the October 7th, the barbaric attacks against, Israel were the precipitating factor.
By Hamas.
By Hamas, yeah.
Yeah, so
Backed by Iran.
there's a delicate ceasefire negotiation going on right now, but you didn't have any trouble saying who was the instigator of the attack.
I would look at it differently, Senator,
you equivocated about the Russian invasion.
If I could stop both of my friends. There's been some talking over, and our stenographer's having trouble. So if we could avoid that.
Yeah, you were introduced as a truth teller by the Vice President. That's a really important thing. And my point is, if you're willing to say the truth about the Hamas invasion of Israel, I hope you wouldn't be equivocal about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Let me ask you about two particular topics. In your advanced policy questions on page 47, 48, you were asked a question about transnational criminal organizations. And I'm curious about this. TCOs, including those transporting fentanyl, pose a direct threat to Americans. I believe this is a very important matter for the U.S. government to address. The United States should do so in ways that are practical, results-oriented, and sustainable. In light of this, the lead organizations are likely normally to be non-DOD. You then went on to say the DOD plays an important role. Talk a little bit about the way you see the effort against TCOs, the lead role of non-DOD and the supporting role of DOD.
Well, thanks, Senator, and I know this is a special focus of yours, so this is something I'd want to learn more about, but I'm very conscious that, and this gets to some of the sort of back and forth in other contexts, that military force is not a panacea. It's critical. It needs to be part of the so-called, of the president's menu of options, and in certain cases, it's absolutely necessary and can solve a problem. But things like transnational criminal organizations that are, crime has been with us since we got out of the, out of the jungles or whatever. It's going to be there, but we can reduce it. I think a big part of that is going to be obviously integration with the diplomatic arms, with capable partners who are willing to and able to do more, for instance, in places like Latin America and other places as well. So I see DOD. I think it's important for the department to be more aware and active in those conversations. My impression, somewhat from within the department, but often from the outside, is that that's considered to be sort of out of the department's purview. I think it's important that the department be there, not necessarily always saying everything's to be solved with a hammer, but to be part of that conversation. And I'll say, I think the kind of people who are being populated in the senior levels of the State Department and elsewhere, the National Security Council, I would believe I could have a very good conversation and integration and collaboration along those lines, as well as Congress on these issues.
And I think when you talk to the Southcom leadership, they're going to really emphasize that a lot of non-DOD assets are very important in this fight. I want to ask you a question about AUKUS. Because I'm on foreign relations and armed services, I've been pretty involved in the AUKUS framework. Pillar 1 also is pretty heavily invested in Virginia. You did a tweet in August where you said, AUKUS, in principle, it's a great idea. But I've been very skeptical in practice. I remain skeptical, agnostic as I put it, but more inclined based on new information I've gleaned it would be crazy to have fewer SSNs, Virginia class, in the right place and time. Talk a little bit about your perspective on AUKUS, the promise of the concept, and if there's practical skepticality, what that is.
Yeah, thank you very much, Senator. I appreciate that. And this is another area where, as I mentioned in my opening statement, where new facts arise. I mean, my perspective is fundamentally, I would say, realistic or pragmatic and kind of data-driven, if you want, adaptive, based on new facts. The idea of empowering our Australian, in some sense, perhaps our closest ally in the world, they've been with us even in our less advisable wars, is the way I put it. It's a great idea for them to have attack submarines. But the problem is that we are, as Secretary Rubio has said and others, there's a very real threat of a conflict in the coming years, God forbid, over, along the first island chain. And our attack submarines, as you know well, Senator, are absolutely essential for making the defense of Taiwan or otherwise a viable and practical option, to my conversation with Senator Cotton. So if we can produce the attack submarines in sufficient number and sufficient speed, then great. But if we can't, that becomes a very difficult problem, because we don't want our servicemen and women to be in a weaker position and more vulnerable, and God forbid worse, because they're not in the right place in the right time. So my perspective, and what I've told the Australians and also the Brits, is, if confirmed, or before, I think it should be the policy of the United States government to do everything we can to make this work. And again, as we talked about in your office, Senator, this is getting back to restoring our defense industrial capacity so that we don't have to face these awful choices, but rather can be in a position where we can produce not only for ourselves, but for our allies.
Having more capacity, even if it's a joint capacity, is a good thing. We just have to be careful as we try to produce an Australian capacity that we don't end up in a time period where we're sort of less than we would otherwise be.
Precisely, Senator.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.